Hi everyone, welcome to today's event. I'm just gonna wait a little bit for some of our attendees to show up. Okay. Thank you everyone and welcome to today's event live from the studio with James Harry. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Pauni Barra and I am the Public Programs and Residency Coordinator here at Griffin Projects. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that our work takes place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Xwalacktun, the Squamish, and Salish nations, to whom we're deeply grateful. As well, we would like to thank the BC Arts Council for the support of the residency program. A housekeeping note before we begin. If you would like to see live captions displayed for today's presentation, you can enable this by selecting the CC Live Transcription button at the bottom of your screen. As well, at the end of today's presentation, there will be time for audience questions. So if at any point throughout the presentation you have a question for our presenter, feel free to type it in the Q&A dialog box and I'll read it. Without further ado, I'll introduce James Harry. James Harry was born of Squamish Nation and Namgis descent in 1989. James began carving in early childhood with his father, Xwalacktun. He graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from Emily Carr University of Art and Design in 2014 and completed an internship in the United Kingdom in 2011, where he learned metal casting and taught Coast Salish sculpture, painting, and drawing in Scottish communities. Harry's diverse portfolio includes cedar carvings, metal carvings, light installations, and murals. Harry has created large-scale and prominent public art pieces across the Lower Mainland for over a decade, including the YVR Airport metal totem in 2011, UBC cedar metal carving permanent installation in 2016, City of Richmond stone drawing design in 2018, Vancouver School Board 40 feet totem in 2019, Cineplex Cinemas Park Royale, and I wrote it in here, Xwemelch'stn in 2019. Blackcomb Whistler Mountain Designs Washington Whatcom Community College. It's a permanent installation in 2021. So please take it away, Harry.
Yeah, thanks, Fawn. I'll just share my screen here. So you can see my screen fine?
Yes, we can see it fine.
All right, thanks. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this residency. And, I've been really looking forward to working and producing more works in the studio. It's been really an amazing time to think about my work and research and try to figure out alternate paths to how I would approach my work. It's always nice to have a new space outside of my regular working space to think about my work and concepts. So yeah, it's been a real privilege so far, and I'm looking forward to completing the work that I have there right now. So I'll just go a little bit back into my background. I'm a Squamish Nation and Namgis. So my grandmother, she is from Alert Bay, so Kwakwakiwak, as well as Squamish on my dad's side, so my grandpa. And so there's a lot of shared design languages and culture between the two that I've utilized in the past, and now I'm looking forward to spreading more knowledge around Salish art. I've been focusing more on my Salish side since I've been talking to my dad when I was a kid. I was always trying to kind of find my voice in my work and my art. And so it was always really interesting for me to learn my Quagyu side. But now that I'm older, I've been really trying to focus on bringing more recognition to Salish design, mainly because of the territory that we're living on and the lack of knowledge that there has been in the past. So, you know, I feel that there's been a lot of work that's been doing recently into educating people about who we are and our identity, our design language, and our culture. And so with every piece that I've created, it's more than just an artwork. It's a piece that's responding to the land, and it's often resolved by thinking about the name of place. In this case here, you can see on my left, I'm standing beside a metal totem that I had done in 2019 that sits right beside Capilano River. And we had named that river Xwemelch'stn, which means fast moving water of fish. And we had villages like right there beside Capilano River. And that's what the village was called, was Xwemelch'stn. So I created this piece thinking about the history of that village. And you can see that there's a salmon design and some salmon eggs, and I've kind of represented it in this sort of swirling motion, representing that kind of current, that fast current that salmon had to swim up. So as I want to kind of illustrate that that's where I start my thinking, is trying to give voice back to the land, and it's also serves as a piece that people can recognize and put a name to, but also educates people on the land and the history before. So my practice kind of comes into different forms. I could say 3 different forms, actually. One where it's a little bit more minimalist and abstract. And in some cases, if you didn't have as much knowledge about Salish art, you might not look at these pieces as being Salish design, mainly just because of how simple and universal some of these shapes can be, like the circle, for example. You can see that seen across all cultures, but this is like one of the most prominent shapes and forms that are used to make up Salish design. So with these pieces, I've sort of thought of them as like how maybe pieces that could exist as their own standalone sculpture. So it's sort of talking about, like, if I'm thinking about erecting these in places in our city, or places around Vancouver, the Lower Mainland, or anywhere in British Columbia for that matter, that it's thinking about the shapes and forms that came out of the land. So really, these sculptures are just having a conversation with the land that they would be standing on. My whole art practice has been about my theory and my sort of understanding, or my like interest has been in how Indigenous people historically came up with these shapes and forms. Like, I was always so curious, how did they come up with these shapes? And as I started to like go for walks in nature. I traveled the world and looked at different places and how different caves were formed, or how water moved, or how fire moved, or just like the elements. There was always this natural kind of movement and way about everything. So I kind of came to the conclusion that Indigenous people were just observers of nature and really took in all of that. So that these symbols can kind of almost symbolize that it is nature that's coming out. So that's what this relationship of these pieces to me mean if they were to exist as independent sculptures in different places in our society. This one, for example, the trigon and the extended crescent working together in unison here as one piece. And then looking and thinking of these as pieces that people could move through. And as they start to develop these relationships and understandings with these pieces, they can start to think and reflect more on the historical context and why they would be there in the first place. So some of these pieces are actually concepts that I might be presenting as future public art installations, and some of them are in the middle of being produced for specific public art installations. So this one could be a potential one, but this, again, moving back to that idea of this simple form of the crescent, it's one of the most prominently used shapes in Salish art. Thinking about its relationship from how the sun might be hitting it and creating these shadows, as well as the scale and size being very important in thinking about how people's bodily or visceral connection to these works might alter or make them think differently about these shapes. So again, there's some pieces I was thinking in reflection to like modern architecture or other pieces, and how could they coexist in our society today, and for what does it mean for people to be like living with these things and starting to develop new relationship with these symbols. And then there's projects where I've kind of tried to utilize those forms and put them together in a form of a bit more of practical use, or something where this could serve as a bus shelter, as well as look at the whole piece as this thing that could exist on a bridge as this sort of like portal or gateway into, this is a possible project that I had been proposing for the Sanok project in just on the Burrard Bridge. So a chance that could be a possibility to think about the history of Sanok in relation to Vancouver. And as well as these are pieces where I've proposed these projects as well in other various developments. And sort of almost like thinking about it as this really almost alien artifact that's been like, it almost kind of looks like it's from the future. And I've always been interested in that relationship and that dichotomy between like this very ancient way of like knowing and creating, but also thinking about like the juxtaposition between like this very futuristic feeling, almost like they've kind of landed, they've come out from away from this planet and like they've just sort of landed here. And I'm really interested in like that relationship between like this almost sort of sci-fi element and historical significance that I personally have with these shapes and forms. And then there's the other side to my art practice, which is more in metalwork and thinking through carving as that was the medium that I learned in, and thinking about these metal pieces as if they were low relief carvings, but just done with metal. And the technology that we have these days has been able to give us the ability to layer these different types of materials in ways that we previously couldn't have done before. So for example, you know, there's a mixture of stainless steel and aluminum in this piece, where I was thinking of these as if they were carvings, but then designing them so that they could also be kind of stacked and layered as in metal pieces. So if you can imagine, I couldn't really figure out how to do it in the rendering programs, but there's also going to be these beveled edges on all of these lines to kind of represent and put a nod towards that history of wood carving. So this piece is actually titled All My Relations. And again, this is just another piece where I was really wanting to highlight our history, our ways of knowing, through a piece that would recognize like our really deep and interconnected knowledge with the land, the animals, and not even just thinking of them as physical objects, but as something that kind of transcends the physical world and more speaks to the spiritual, and this thing that we can't quite see, but we feel. So I was trying to think about how I could represent that in this piece. And to me, weaving was a really symbolic thing for me to represent that, because it was said that the weaver would kind of bring the spirit world into the physical world by weaving the spindle whorl and weaving and bringing those meanings into life. So I really wanted to juxtapose that weaving pattern with this more like illustrative design, almost like a storybook kind of thing, where it's talking about that like deep connection that we have with everything, really, with the animals, the land, the water, sky. We don't think of ourselves as separate from these things. And this is something that has been kind of ingrained in me since I was a kid, learning under my dad, Xwalacktun, where he always had these stories attached with his pieces. So I always had that really deep connection to my culture that way, and really trying to make that feeling that I had available to people that might not have been as fortunate to me to grow up with all of those teachings. So on the left is the longhouse, and I wanted to represent like that spirit and that connection to the fire and the earth. I used to go into a lot of sweat lodges with my uncle Huya, and we'd do sweat lodges, and we would get on all fours and go into the sweat lodge and say all my relations, and every time we entered, and all my relations, and every time we came out, in order to respect those that came before and those that are coming after, because we were never thinking just in the moment. We were thinking of the past and the present and the future, and thinking into future generations. And that's also why I chose, every time you look into my pieces, I really try to represent the number 7, because that's also a really symbolic number that is used in my culture, because we're always thinking 7 generations ahead, and that's why we never overfished, or we never overtook anything that we didn't need, because we needed it to be there for our grandkids and our great grandkids. This piece was a commission that I had won for the New Westminster Aquatic Center, and I did a piece that I really wanted to reflect that land element, that was really acknowledging the land that this building has been built on. This building is a New Westminster Aquatic Center, which was actually built on top of the Glenbrook Ravine in New Westminster. And so when I was kind of creating concepts for this piece, I was really thinking about the shape of the land. So what I had done is I actually had surveyed different topography around different elevations around the site. And I had found that this ravine had been carved into this sort of like S shape. And you see that in nature with rivers, like there's always repeating patterns of like S shapes and S forms, these little valleys that it carves out. And so what I did with this piece is I took those elevations to inform the shape of the sculpture. And I included like this Salish design element in the middle where it's kind of carved out like this kind of ravine in the sculpture. So again, another piece that's responding to the land that our Western world has been building over. There's so much of the history of the land here that is kind of covered up, and I wanted to really bring that to light through this piece. So, and in the inner recession of this is also done in this kind of copper gilding, which is a really important material to us. Because it was used for, like, we traded it through copper shields, through different nations would do trades, and it was usually the highest revered chiefs that would have copper. And so I really just wanted to acknowledge that part of the history of our people, and I often try to use copper in my work to tell that story. And then there's the other part of the sort of metal and light piece to my work, where I'm really trying to work through like contrast of material and light. I really love working and trying to play with light to kind of help tell the visual story of my pieces. And I started working on these because when I was younger, we used to really have a lot of access to red and yellow cedar, but I knew that there would be a day that we wouldn't be able to carve as much anymore, like because it's the material is becoming overlogged, and even for cultural use, it's kind of to that point where we can't really use it sustainably as a material anymore. So I started working towards using metal to kind of still tell those visual stories that are in relation to the land, talking about the land, talking about the history, and talking about our village sites. And again, this site here, Cineplex Cinemas, has been built over our Xwemelch'stn village. So that's what this piece is reminding us of, is that history and connection to that place. And so I wanted to also just kind of briefly go into the third part of my art practice, which has been mural painting with my partner, Lauren Brevner. And we've done quite a few collaborative pieces together. And more notably, this is something that this piece here is on Thurlow and Pender, just painted on the Bentall Center, downtown Vancouver. And we were sort of awarded this opportunity to create something, and this was at the height of the pandemic in 2020, during just after George Floyd had been murdered. And Lauren and I had been talking about Indigenous people and Black people standing in solidarity, because we share so many similar stories and histories, that we really felt that this would be an opportunity to make a powerful piece in this like standing together and through culture, and again, doing this like as if it's like this woven blanket, thinking about this like connection to the physical and spiritual world, that we're always being watched over by our ancestors. And that's what the Salish eye at the top represents. So like this idea that we're kind of covering our city with our symbols to really strengthen and empower our people to feel like we're not invisible on our own territory, because historically we have felt invisible on our territory for so long. And I think this is probably one of our most successful pieces to date, just telling that story and how we feel ourselves, and how we exist in this world ourselves. And this was just a really powerful opportunity to show the city and show our country that this is something that, can't go unheard about. And yeah, so like you can go into some of those shapes and forms again that are really, again, just coming out of out of my culture. And that brought us to doing a piece for the Vancouver Art Gallery, which was an installation along the same vein, where we're trying to also kind of talk about both of our cultures, and Lauren being Japanese Trinidadian and mine being as a mix as well. I'm Salish and German and Scottish, and together we've sort of like had to struggle with our identities and figuring out, like, sometimes we're pushed in one direction and you can never really fully exist as one or the other. We're always being we have the ability to move between worlds, but we're also there's a lot of frustrations that come out of that as well. And what we have found when we collaborate together is that we kind of work through those emotions together, because we understand what it's like coming from both ends. And I think that there's like a lot of power that comes through that in our work, and that's a lot of like that emotion that we feel and we try to put on the canvas or put on a wall when we're creating. So every like ounce of ourselves is really going into each piece. You can see that here with this piece. This was our first mural we did together, the Grateful Heron, that we did on Granville Island. And this was sort of like the start of our mural painting journey together. And then this was another piece that we had done on the Broadway Arbutus Greenway, which is now actually torn down and being turned into the SkyTrain station. So I'm actually in the middle of trying to put in a bid to do some artwork for that building as well. So we'll see how that one goes. But yeah, that's the end of my presentation. I guess I'll open it up to questions. And yeah, we can go from there.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, James. So yeah, as you said, we can open it up for questions. However, sometimes people take their time typing their questions. So please, folks, if you have questions, start typing. And while we wait for questions, I do want to ask something. So you were saying that through your work, you're kind of starting like a conversation with the land, or giving a voice to the land, and relating to the elements. And I wonder like how your sculptures have been perceived, like how people relate to your sculptures. Have you seen that bodily relation that they have to the sculptures?
Yeah, so I've really gotten a lot of positive feedback from my community about these pieces. And it's sometimes hard because sometimes I really want to be very honorable to my past, but I also want to think of the future at the same time. And sometimes I do worry if like I am pushing it too far for some Indigenous folk that might not be as receiving as what I'm trying to put out. But at the same time, I don't think we should say stagnant. We always need to adapt and change kind of our thinking as well, because we always need to kind of move into the future together. So there's that part to it, but also I want it to be I want non-Indigenous people to look at these pieces and feel a connection to it, where they might think differently about our culture and develop a new kind of feeling or emotion that they didn't know they had before about the beauty of our culture. We almost lost everything compared to, like Salish art was like almost at the brink of being gone. And it was kind of just like my dad's generation that started bringing it back. Because even when he started, he was like carving Northern style First Nations artwork, because that was really the only thing that was like available in terms of like, if you wanted to like practice your culture, that's kind of all there was in terms of what people knew about. So we're really just kind of into the next generation of just pushing it forward just that much further. I don't know if I answered your question properly, but
No, you did. Thank you. And you have a piece where you were talking about the futuristic feeling, forms that come from away, but it still contain all the historical references.
yeah.
And how do you feel being the generation that is pushing that forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's scary, but it's exciting at the same time, because I think if you know it's scary, then you know that it's probably something that's good. It's like you're pushing the boundaries a little bit, and nobody's done it really, so it's kind of new ground and new territory, and that's kind of like you're trying to pave your own path, and you never know what lies ahead. And I think that's what the scary part is, but I think it's also a positive one, because there's just so much for other people to learn. There's so much for me to learn along the way, that like as I'm making these pieces, it's like I'm breathing every ounce of myself into it. It's, I grew up in part of the culture, so I feel like whatever it is that I'm doing is pushing it in a way that's positive, and that's where I'm always coming from, is like a positive direction.
Yeah.
And really, my aim and my hope, my goal is that the more that there is of this that exists out there, the more that people will live with it and start to understand our culture, that it's not just like stuck in the past. Like we're there, and that's one of the biggest struggles I had growing up, was like people always like trying to romanticize us as people that were stuck in the past. And because I grew up like carving with my dad, we'd carve totem poles, or we carve house posts in the public. So often we get a lot of public opinion about what it is that we should be doing. And a lot of the times we'd get comments that were either racist, or they didn't think they were being racist. They thought they were just being like kind of smart, or smart. I say smart in like, oh, you shouldn't be using a chainsaw because, like that's not what your ancestors did.
Oh, God.
It's like, so I kind of grew up with like those frustrations, like, my dad kind of put me into the thick of it, but I think that's for a good reason, to see and respond. And that's part of what I'm trying to do through my work, is also dismantle those like judgments and opinions of like, well, look, I'm using technology to make these things. It's no different for me than it is for you. So, let's not focus on that. Let's focus on what the concept is about. And focus on like the thinking behind the work, because really that's the thing that's going to transform everybody's opinion at the end of the day. And that's why I'm such a strong and firm believer in art, because it has this power to do what politics can't. It'll over the years, it will start to kind of be a part of people's lives, where they start to like have this love and this relationship with it that no words could really do.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions now. One is from Miret Rodriguez. You can see these questions in the Q&A panel, but I will read it to you. So it says, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your work. Your public sculpture looks spectacular, although I haven't experienced them in person. My question is geared more towards your collab mural on Thurlow. Could you speak more about the meaning of some of the shapes and forms we see there? On the lower half, do we see the depiction of a wolf and an eagle? What did they represent?
Yeah, I can just bring it to those images. Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Miret, for your question. Excuse me. So a lot of the shapes that are used here are coming from the wood carving shapes that you would normally see on like a house post, for example, or a spindle whorl. So the crescent, trigon, and circle. And those three shapes are the main utilizing shapes to carve up a depiction. And with those three shapes, you can really make up quite a lot of compositions, depending on how you curve or bend them around different shapes. They're often used to insinuate form, like, so it's kind of like designed to kind of guide your eye throughout a work. So there's a lot of strategic placement with those three forms. But also there's these other shapes that are coming from weaving patterns, like these triangle shapes, these square shapes down here, as well as these kind of like candy shapes. Those are really a lot of repeating patterns that would come out of Salish weaving. And you know, I wanted to really start to like show more of those patterns through my work, to also highlight that weaving tradition, as well as like this idea of like blanketing like different parts of our city that is like really giving back to our identity. So it's really just sort of this mixture actually between these two. Like I'm really pulling inspiration from these two like traditions of wood carving and weaving, and representing them in a mural, as well as like this idea of a button blanket, and that's what's represented here. I had those 7, well, here I have 6 dots, but including the hand, which is also supposed to represent the 7th, trying to represent that number 7 as well, talking about those 7 generations. So and then here there's like that stitching pattern holding all of those together. So, and then also in this piece here, there's the Thunderbird in the background, which I think you kind of have to have a little bit more of a trained eye to see, because there's the eye of the Thunderbird here, where it's kind of like going over her face as like this tattoo, almost, that it's like almost like they're one, you know, thinking about when I'm talking about the spiritual and physical world, the Thunderbird is a supernatural creature that represents that connection between the spiritual and the physical world. And that's why I kind of chose to represent it over her face, because we're talking about the solidarity of Indigenous and Black people, but we're trying to move forward in this positive way. And we're also reminding us that we're always being watched over. So that's what that represents. And then down at the bottom, you have the Thunderbird again and the wolf. The Thunderbird at the top here, you can tell it's a Thunderbird because every time it has a crest over its head, that represents the Thunderbird. If it didn't have that, then it would be an eagle. They're very similar in design. And then, yeah, the wolf, which you can tell it's a wolf, it has a longer snout. If it was shorter and wider, it would be a bear. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Amy Longo. And the question is, you spoke about the influence of science fiction on your pieces. Do you consider your work as being related to Indigenous futurism?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. Yeah, I'm always thinking Indigenous futurism is a relatively new concept that I've heard, and when I heard more about it, I was actually quite intrigued, because that's kind of like how I felt about the direction of these pieces. Like I might have been subconsciously doing that, but I've always thought about these pieces being like something that would be an alternate future, like thinking of this alternate future as well. Like what if all of the buildings were designed by Indigenous people, or like what would our city look like? Like there's, and that's kind of like, I'm also coming from more of an architectural, like I'm thinking as an architect in a lot of these pieces as well, trying to integrate them, not as just a single art piece, but as like functional pieces that could exist within our city that would also transform that sort of idea. Like, and that's what really intrigues me, is like how those things can exist together. And I would really love to see more like Indigenous designers or Indigenous architects and Indigenous, yeah, artists like coming together to like really transform these spaces.
Yeah. Thank you. And also Amy asks, can you speak about your process collaborating with another artist?
Yeah, well, the only other artist I collaborated with is with Lauren, and mainly I think it's just because she's like the only one I can get along with when it comes to designing. It's just because we have such a specific way of working, and like even we'll still have like our predicaments where we disagree with each other, and it's like, but we always somehow figure out how to work through it. That it's like, for example, let's just go to one of the murals. Like if we the whole reason I feel that we can work together is like when I first saw her work like back in 2014, and she had a show. I looked at some of her designs and I was like, wow, that's really close to my design language. Like this is kind of like how I work as well. So I already kind of felt that there was that connection between like how we would work. And when it came time to work with her, it was like really, really intuitive. And we just kind of like could answer it for each other just based on like making a few lines. Or we're both like, I love diagonals. Let's do everything on a diagonal. Let's, I like this pattern, and let's try and figure out how we can work it in here. And sometimes maybe we would not place something in the wrong spot, and we might correct each other in different placements. And because it's all really heavy design work when it comes to it, it's all really methodical. We think through a lot of these designs, and it takes us quite a long time to arrive to the final piece, because we do constant edits through everything. So yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's like there's and also I'm really trying to think and be aware of her background and her identity when we're working together, trying to like really incorporate more Japanese and Trinidadian pieces to bring more of her into the piece, because a lot of the time, or like she's painting the portraits, but there's more Salish design than there is Trinidadian design, for example, but really wanting to like pull from both of our identities to like really make it more of our piece. And you can kind of see hints of that through each piece, right? So yeah, if that answers your question.
Hopefully it does. It's truly intriguing how your design languages convey and like all this significance, even though you're coming from such different places. Like for instance, this piece you were talking about, like how you both were navigating through your complex identities, and that you kind of belong to one world and then to another, and how does that translate into the design phase of your work?
Yeah, I think it's really tough. It's really tough actually, because we're at a time right now where a lot of people are really trying to give more light and more voice to Salish art and recognizing the history. But also like they're at the same time, like with all the things that were happening to Indigenous people, there was a lot of things happening to Japanese people, like within internment camps, and like a lot of Indigenous people ended up hanging out with Japanese people back in the day, because like there were so many similarities there. And that's part of like what I really would hope to like bring more voice to, is like more of like that Japanese and Indigenous connection and the roots there. So and that's kind of like where we were almost arriving with this piece at the VAG, and trying to find that common ground between the two cultures. And yeah, because there is so much history there, but at the same time, like I was saying, like there's certain light given to and priority given to for a good reason. With Salish art, it's like we were our voices were silenced for so long, but it's only now that we're starting to come back. So yeah, it's I think that's why it's also so important to be highlighting those other conversations as well.
Yeah. And maybe on that same round, we have this last question, who is also from Miret Rodriguez. And they ask, what is one project you still haven't done and that you highly hope to get done one day?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it's really, there are a few pieces actually. And this is one of them. I was kind of talking about that there are a lot of politics involved to getting these pieces out there. And I would love to be able to talk about these pieces as their individual forms, but I find that it might be a little bit too fast paced for some, because like it's too simple, I think, for a lot of people. Like I have put these concepts forward, but I feel like the minimalism is it's for some people not saying enough. And that's what I would hope, is that I would be able to kind of speak more to these pieces where it's like really purposefully trying to be minimalist, and talk about the forms. Like the forms come out of the land and they can exist in their most simple form, because really it is that relationship between that design language in the land. And I think that says enough. It's just really hard to convince a room full of people to kind of jump on board with those concepts. So yeah.
Do you think we need to be more trained in Salish design to understand, what you are
Absolutely.
proposing? Yes.
Yeah, we're definitely, I think it's just a little too ahead of its time right now for people to like kind of understand that just yet.
What will be your hope for a future?
I would love to see this piece exist, and as well as these other pieces I have here. This one, the trigon. I have put these forward as concepts, but every time they don't win. So yeah, I'll keep trying.
Yeah. Thank you so much, James. Thank you so much for an incredible artist talk, and then all the answers to our questions. It's been truly an honor to hear you talk today. And thank you everyone for joining us here today live from the studio with James Harry. If you would like to know more about Griffin Art projects, you can subscribe to our newsletter at the bottom of our website, which I will place in the chat right now for everyone to see. We have some programming coming your way for the fall, and we would love to see you there. So there's the page. And yeah, thank you once more, James.
Thank you. And
Okay.
thanks to everyone who joined.
Okay, see you everyone.
Okay, bye.